Well, will you turn, as we begin the study on Israel, holiness and unholiness, to Exodus 15. And we're going to read some of the words from that chapter, verse 11 and verse 17, because it gives us an introduction to the God of holiness, Israel's God. We're going to see that he became known as the Holy One of Israel, and it also introduces us to the nature of the relationship between the Holy Father and the people of Israel. So we read from verse 11, "Who is like thee among the gods, O Lord? Who is like thee, majestic in holiness?" There's the fountainhead. "Awesome in praises, working wonders. Thou didst stretch out thy right hand, the earth swallowed them. In thy loving kindness thou hast led the people whom thou hast redeemed. In thy strength thou hast guided them to thy holy habitation." And we'll just miss those next verses and go to 17. "You will bring them and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, the place, O Lord, which thou hast made for thy dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, which thy hands have established." So right from the beginning of Israel's history, her understanding and her relationship is with one who is holy. Now, if you look at those verses, particularly verse 11 through to 13, holiness is not an abstract thing, is it? It's the action of a person. And the action that is delineated there, things like you've stretched out your hand, you've intervened, in other words, and you've intervened with loving kindness in verse 13. You've led your people. More importantly, we're going to see as we go on that the action is one of redemption. In fact, this is the first mention of God as being holy in the Old Testament. We'll come back to that, because he was holy before that. Then we see things like in your strength you've guided them into that holy relationship with you that has to do with where they are in the land. Verse 17, "You'll bring them and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, the place, O Lord, which you've made for your dwelling." So the operation there of his holiness is with his people and with respect to his people. So he becomes known as the Holy One of Israel. So turn to Leviticus 21. Verse 8. And because of the two studies coming together, we're not going to have a chance of getting through all of these scripture passages, nor perhaps should we. So I'll just take you through some and presume that you'll come back and catch up on the others. Leviticus 21:8, and it says, "You shall consecrate him for he offers the bread of your God. He shall be holy to you, for I, the Lord, who sanctifies you, am holy." So his revelation to them in his actions was one of holiness, and his instructions to them in their relationship to him was, of course, in that same direction. In Isaiah 12, verse 6, it's interesting that these 8th century prophets are the ones who cry out and address the people to cry out to the Holy One of Israel. "Cry aloud and shout for joy, O inhabitants of Zion, for great in your midst is the Holy One of Israel." We were sharing just yesterday what a tremendous confrontation it was for the people to come back out of Babylon as something of a dwindled nation, and to find that God actually said to them at one occasion, "I will return to Jerusalem." Now, in that sense, he'd never left Jerusalem, but Jerusalem was lying desolate. They'd been home 18 years. They were still sitting amongst the bricks and the burnt out stuff. And the whole indicator to them was that God's judgment, which was present everywhere in front of them, had not ended. And then he says through Zechariah, "I will return to Jerusalem." And the big impact of that, of course, was that God's judgment had finished. And this This is echoed by these 8th century prophets as the great declaration of God's Holy One. They saw him as the Holy One of Israel, who loved Israel and took her through judgment to purification to the end of judgment, which is all, of course, something of an antitype of what's coming with Christ. So God's the Holy One of Israel. Therefore we say, as we have in the notes there, that everything that comes from the Holy One, Israel itself, is holy. In Exodus 15, that passage that we looked at, just flip back to there. He talks about guiding them to a holy habitation, which, if it means anything, at least it means a holy relationship. They are to be in that holiness with him. In Leviticus 11:45, that's close there, he says, I'm the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. Thus you shall be holy, for I'm holy. And we see not only is that it's certainly not just a kind of cold command to go out and practice morality, but it's a command in the context of his relationship as the Holy One that says, you shall be holy, you're with me. We get that? So that holiness is not something that God puts on us as an extra, but it's something that comes to us in relationship with him. That's something that's going to come through, because the whole thing of holiness is in grace, of course. Anything that's not of grace in that sense is profane. Now that's very powerful. So Israel is holy, and she is not just holy, not to get into a huddle and be holy, but her holiness, if you like to say it, God is holy to her and she reflects his holiness, and in that human sense she is to reflect that holiness which represents the relationship that she has with the living God. She is to reflect that to the nations. Okay, so if you look at Exodus 19:2, for instance, and we'll just read those following verses. In verse 3, Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the sons of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you up on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples. Now, who were all the peoples? All the peoples of the nations. Okay, immediately those around her, of course, but ultimately, as we'll see, through God's elective purpose, to the whole nations, the Gentile nations in toto. So they were to be his own possession among all the peoples, because all the earth is his. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So there, God is holy, Israel is holy, that relation is worked out in holiness, and that relationship is a tremendous witness. Now they blew it, didn't they? And it didn't become a tremendous witness in one sense. In another sense, God was always witnessing to his glory, and that's what Isaiah and the 8th century prophets got excited about. But they were a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, which of course we see Peter taking up and actually saying now the church is that. So Israel's and her relationship with God and his holiness is really quite fundamental to where we're going. And what we're really doing in this study is, in a sense, laying the foundation to see God's action of holiness developed through history. So God is holy in all his actions. We won't look at those passages in particular, except to say that when we look at Isaiah 57, and he is the high, transcendent, lifted up one, but he comes and dwells with the contrite in heart, very similar to what Paul says in Ephesians 4, where he says he's the Father who is over all, in all, through all. That holiness is that relationship with him as Father. Let's move on quickly then to point 2, God's holy covenant. Actually, these next 4 points, are, if we like to say, the means of God's grace to Israel to keep them within that holy relationship. Someone has said that when God commanded these means of grace, and we're talking about the covenant, the law, the worship, and the sacrifice, and each one of those is a story, not a story, each one of those is a whole study, isn't it? But as God commanded these means of grace, or when he commanded these means of grace that were to operate through faith, not just ritualistically, but through faith, and that's an important element we'll see later in our relationship of holiness. When God commanded these means of grace through faith to the holy relationship that he wanted, he didn't introduce new elements into his relationship with the human scene. In other words, elements of get it right in form, get it right in ritual, get it right in moral strivings, and we'll get brownie points. He's not introducing anything like that, but to reveal the nature of his holy relationship with them. So the truth about covenant, the truth about law, the truth about worship, the truth about sacrifice is all to bring to them an understanding of the holy relationship that he has with his people. Okay, so they could just walk in it. None of these things were there as a put on, were they? And in fact, as soon as man takes the covenant and makes it a thing that he puts on and he does, he profanes the covenant and so on. And so too with the law. Well, let's have a look at them in that light very quickly. In that passage in Exodus that we looked at twice before, you're only 3 chapters away, so flip back to it. As I said, it's the first mention of God being holy. Now, God was holy. He's always been holy. He is holy. But when we come to the historic revelation of that, it's interesting, isn't it? More than interesting. It's very significant that holiness first, if you like, explodes on Israel's scene when it's revealed to them that the God who has redeemed them is the Holy One. In other words, all of the action of redemption, got to watch out, I don't want it. All the action of redemption is the graphic, grabbing them by the scruff of the neck, if you like, illustration of what a holy Father does with his people. And so it becomes such a very clear contrast, the holy action of God in redeeming his people out of Egypt, between the impotent and the impotent idols that they had known and had seen at work in Egypt. You know, here's the action of the living God in a holy way, grasping his people and doing something, not just promising to do something. So Israel first experiences the holy love of God in that dynamic sense when God redeems her, or at least it breaks through on her then. So we see very quickly that the covenant that God makes to bring his people out of Egypt is a demonstration of his holiness. It's a demonstration of his sovereignty, which is very important, because if Israel is to be kept as his holy people, then he has to be the one who is over not only Israel but all of the nations around Israel. The same today, isn't it? That some Christians say, well, I can understand how the Lord is Lord over the church, but he doesn't seem to be Lord over the world scene. Well, if he's not Lord over the world, he's not Lord over the church. That's another story, isn't it? And it's fascinating when we come to passages like Psalm 99 that deals with the covenant relationship. Just flip to that. The covenant relationship with Israel and his fidelity, as it says on top of my scripture, his fidelity to Israel. That the psalmist talks about many things in that psalm. He talks about God establishing equity and justice and strength and love and worship. And then he ends up the first section by saying, what? He is holy. And then he goes through the next section and talks about God's loving kindness and being the avenger. And those two are not contrary. And then he finishes up with it all and saying, exalt the Lord our God and worship in his holy hill, for holy is the Lord our God. So the covenant relationship was the bilateral demonstration of God to his people that he's holy and he will do what he will do. And so we understand that when he comes and makes covenant, he says things like, I will make my covenant. I will keep my covenant. So if we want to go to the obverse of that, God's people inherit his covenant holiness. To reject his covenant is to in fact be unholy, because it's rejecting not just a promise that God has said, oh, I'm going to do something with you and take you somewhere, but it's rejecting the one who's made that promise. And it's saying virtually that promise is redundant in the reality of things as to where we want to go as people. And of course that's not just a rejection of a good idea that God had, it's the rejection of reality, the real way in which he planned for his people to grow. Well, let's move on quickly. And you look up all of those passages, in particular that one in Deuteronomy 29:55 about the rejection of the covenant. And it's very interesting. Perhaps we ought to look up just that passage before we go on. And if we don't finish, well, we don't finish, but we'll try. Because it introduces us to two things. First of all, he says, because they forsook the covenant of the Lord, the God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they went and served other gods. In other words, the forsaking of the covenant wasn't just in a vacuum, it was the choice of saying, we would rather have these gods serve us because it seems to us that they're going to take us somewhere where we want to go, whereas God's covenant particularly doesn't interest us, we'll leave that. But it's interesting that when that is corrected by grace, by the intervention of God on behalf of his people, in verse 5 of chapter 30, and the Lord your God will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it, and he will prosper you and multiply you more than your fathers. Moreover, the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants. Can you see then that to reject the covenant is to reject the loving relationship with the covenant maker? To be restored with the covenant is to be recycled to love, which is to be recycled to relate to the covenant maker and to see therefore the covenant. It's a bit like what Jesus said, nobody sees the kingdom until he's been recycled. Well, that's what God was doing, even in the face of their unholiness. Well, let's move on quickly then to the law as that second means of grace that we've put down there. Now we can say simply and perhaps simplistically that Israel was separated to keep the law. She was separated from the nations to be a law keeper, but more than that, to be kept by the law itself, because the lawmaker was her father, not just a judge somewhere that thought of some good laws to make, but the laws represented, as I said before, the relationship that she could have with her father and with each other in the light of Father's presence. So she was separated to keep the law and to be kept by the law in that sense. And so it's very much a relational thing. And we see that, don't we, from Psalm 119 and those verses there where the psalmist says that his heart actually delights in the law. Fantastic to belong to the law maker, because all of his laws are to do with relationships and vitality and life. And so his heart actually goes out and gets excited about having the means of the law as the means of grace. Because when people take and took, as Israel did, the law and made it a means of performance, then that was unholy. She profaned the law. So unholiness was to reject the law and the lawgiver in that sense. Let's look then at God's holy worship. And you'll be conscious, won't you, as we're doing this, that we're touching the tips of icebergs. What I'm hoping is coming through is that all of these things were dynamic and exciting and vital, not in a kind of titillating sense to the people of God, but to the basic down-to-earth sense of here they were as a nation, there God was with them as their father, their covenant maker, their law maker, and they loved it. At least those in faith did, or those of faith. So we come to the holy worship, that great means of grace that God gave to his people. Remember that promise in Exodus 7:16, that they were to be released. What does it say? They were to be released from Egypt to worship. To serve, two words there, synonymous. You will say to him, sorry, I've got the wrong one, 7:16, isn't it? Yeah, right, I was reading 6. And you will say to him, the Lord your God, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to say to you, let my people go that they may serve me in the wilderness. So right from the very beginning, there's going to be a sacrament, a grace gift of facilitating a whole nation to serve, to worship. As we've seen earlier in Jeffrey's study, how that fulfilled not just a ritual need for people to get together and have a good time, but it was the basic grace gift of God to people saying, you've been made to worship, and here we are together, me as your covenant maker, law maker, worship, object of worship, let's get it together, let's do it. I've redeemed you for that purpose. You've come out of Egypt with a view to that. Let's look then at Deuteronomy 26. And that should read verse 8, I think, there. Perhaps we can start at verse 5, as it does say. And you shall say before the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down to Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, but there he became a great and mighty and populous nation. And the Egyptians treated us harshly, afflicted us, imposed hard labour on us. Then we cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction and our toil and our oppressions. And the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand, holy hand, an outstretched arm, with great terror, with signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and has given us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now behold, I've brought the first of the produce of the ground, which thou, O Lord, hast given me. And you shall set it down before the Lord your God and worship before the Lord your God. You see the natural outworking of the holy intervention of God in his people. They worship. They just got there and they picked up everything that they could find around them that the land had produced and said, praise the Lord. We're here because of you, Father. And in that interaction, of course, Israel was at home with the living God. She was at home with the creation, all the milk and honey. It was great. And she was at home with herself in that sense. Isn't it? It's good to come together to worship. It's good to worship on your own too, but there's something about coming together with the milk and the honey and everything around and being glad about it, isn't it? Suddenly you feel that that's where things are at, because it is. Okay, so in Israel's history, their worship was out of their relationship. Any other worship is not worship. And all of the things that are attached to Israel's worship, and we really just put our finger on them, all, you know, the tabernacle and the temple and the feast days and the holy days and the celebration days, they're all jam-packed full of vitality, aren't they? They're bursting with the fact that when God's people are in that with him together, it's fantastic. And so they become the symbols to us in that sense of his greatness and his immediacy and all of the other things that we've seen. And so if we're to look at the other side of holiness, unholiness, we see that for God's people to take the temple and to swap that, if you like, or even attempt to bring into those places idols and things that they obtain from their other nations, is to profane the temple. I'll let you look up those verses in Malachi 2 and so on. And as Jeff has said, it's to actually take the relationship of intense purity and just pollute it, to bring it to harlotry. And so Hosea has that very powerful chapter in Hosea 2 of how God's people played the harlot, and Hosea's the prophet, and he's playing out. He has a wife who's gone to harlotry, and God says, now go and marry her again. I want her back. And that, of course, was Israel, wasn't it? Okay, so we come then to the fourth of the means of grace, means of life and vitality, and that's the sacrifice, probably the biggest area to look at, and yet we've at least time to do it. But very simply we can say that the sacrifices, however weird or contrary to our, our cultural way of thinking, they were actually a beautiful means of grace, weren't they? They weren't the means of grace. That was coming, and the true Israel saw that, because Israel says things like, Lord, sprinkle me with a branch of hyssop and I'll be clean. Now, obviously they didn't believe that there was something in a little old branch of hyssop and blood dripping off it. In other words, they believed that God was the God, as we're going to see, who justifies the ungodly. But these things were demonstrations of that, weren't they? So that every time that blood stank in the temple and there were the screams of the animals and so on, it was a very graphic demonstration of God's holiness, of his immanence, his presence with them, and the grace that God was the God who justifies the ungodly, even in the sight of the horror of all that ungodliness. God does it. And so Abraham believed that, and Abraham's offspring, and they enjoyed the good of it. So great, the holy sacrifice was there, all of those sacrifices, and they were many, weren't they? Almost seems too many when we go back and think, well, why did they need all those? Surely one would have done. But it was to do with all their relationships. When they blinded with their neighbour, they had certain things to do, and in the context of those certain things, God's grace came and said, now, I'm the God who justifies the ungodly. Get out and behave with your neighbour like as if it hadn't happened. So it's grace to live in covenant love, not just to live in covenant. Can you see that? It's grace that is to live there with Father, who is the covenant maker, the lover. And so Leviticus 6:2-7 talks about sacrifices making atonement or at one-ment, a means of grace to live at one with others and primarily with the Father. And it's a great means of mercy to them. But of course, when Israel took that and made it so that the sacrifices themselves had some, or they thought they did, had some intrinsic value, so that rather than seeing in the sacrifices the God who justifies the ungodly, they saw in the sacrifices something they could do to be justified, the whole sacrificial system became an abhorrence, didn't it, to the prophets, and the prophets had to tell them that God's not interested in sacrifices like that. What do you think you can buy off God? It's not far from things how we treat things like confession and things today, is it often? Giving God a little bit of penance or whatever. So to profane the holy sacrifice was to treat ritualistically, more than that of course, but at least it was that. And you pick that up in Amos 5:21 and so on. Now we need to go flip the page, and we need to make the transition between the holiness and the unholiness of Israel and the whole teaching on election. Now if you like it, the transition can be like this, that election was the mode, the way God operated to bring his holy people into all of these things. Covenant, law, worship, sacrifice. Election, therefore, is that ministry of God. It's the heart of ministry, really. Somebody has said that election is the heart of the church, because it's the means that God uses for his people to receive mercy. It's never an abstraction. It's the Holy One of Israel extending what otherwise would never ever come to Israel, to the church, to the nations. No election, no gospel. No election, no loving kindness. I don't understand it, do you? But we accept it, don't we? Accept loving kindness, you accept election. So if there's a covenant, which there is, and there is a maker of a covenant, which there is, then it follows that there has to be an heir to that covenant. If you want to put it in terms that we would understand, if we have a last will and testament, there is somebody who makes that, and there's somebody who gets the good of it. And so election is God making out an object to receive the inheritance of the covenant. Sorry, God marking out a recipient to receive the inheritance. So in 1 Peter, let's flip across to the New Testament. In 1 Peter chapter 1, Peter says that he's an apostle of Christ, and he says, to those who reside as aliens scattered through Pontus and Galatia and Cappadocia and Asia and Bithynia, who are chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, or chosen according to his predestinating plan, not just because he could see down the tube, as it were, of history, but because he planned it, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, by the sanctifying work of the Spirit. These are all things that we'll pick up later in the Saturday studies. So that you may obey Jesus Christ and be sprinkled with his blood, may grace, nothing greasy about grace, not slippery anyway, may grace and peace be yours in fullest measure. You know, Peter kind of gets the whole lot and says, well, here it is, all because of God's election. And Paul had the same heart, of course, that was full of it. Every time he thought about election, his heart just went, ooh, fantastic. Because he didn't have that kind of narrow little thing of God choosing this one and leaving that one and kind of pulling out that one for no apparent reason. But he had that vision that God has been the God who elects his people with a view to blessing them with the covenant, blessing their socks off, didn't he, Israel? And then that breaks open in full measure on his dear Son, the elect one, as we're going to see in this study. And out of that, it bursts out over the whole nations. So, you know, really what I'd like us to do is to get a magnificent wide view of God's elective purpose. That's why we've talked about the goal of election being just much wider than itsy-bitsy people getting saved here and there. People get very mad with God about election, don't they? Because they look around and say, well, I wonder if he's going to save my wife. With a whole panorama of God's saving purpose in history is much grander than that, isn't it? I'm not saying we shouldn't be worried about where our wife is or whatever. You get the point, but maybe God's given us some promises there that by faith we just accept, and that she'd get the good of that, wouldn't she? Rather than us wondering about where she is all the time. Well, let's have a look then at the God's elective history. In actual fact, there's no other history, really. You know, men put a lot of thoughts down on paper, but in actual fact, as far as God taking this whole universe from his A to his B, there's simply his history and his elective history, as we'll see. Now, rightly understood, election is not just something that comes in when, for instance, we see God choosing the nation of Israel. It was there, wasn't it? God chose Israel out of Egypt, brought her out as his elect nation. But it wasn't as if God thought between creation and the bringing out of Egypt, what would be a good way of me working? In fact, we see that from Genesis through to that passage in Exodus, his whole way of working has been through the grace of election. And I've just delineated a few there. Seth, for instance. Seth, God appointed Seth. And Adam and Eve saw that. Didn't they? That God had actually appointed Seth. And it's interesting that Seth's children did what? Do you remember? The children of Seth called upon the name of the Lord. So in through a very small window, perhaps, we can see the effectual nature of God's elective purposes. God selects Seth. God elects Seth and gives him to the first couple, and that grace. Not saying he didn't grace the other children, he did, of course, but that grace comes through in his family calling upon the name of the Lord. You can look up those passages. Then Noah, we all know that verse. Noah found grace. Didn't find it under a rock somewhere, did he? Didn't find it in his obedience anywhere. In fact, Noah doesn't impress us as being any more obedient than any of us, does he? But God found him in grace, didn't he? And it's interesting that the writer to the Hebrews in 11:7 talks about Noah and reverence, Noah understanding the holiness of God. Just turn to that quickly. 11:7. By faith, Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, in reverence he prepared an ark. And what created reverence in Noah's life? Well, grace, of course. And what brought through that grace? The fact that God was there. And God was surrounding him with his elective love. And Shem became the forefather of Abraham, and he was blessed above his brothers, it says. And it's not because God has favourites or anything like that, but that he has a purpose, and that purpose is there to work through. And it does, by his grace. So we come to the patriarchal period with Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, in your notes there, and we discover that God has what we could call a familial election. He elects their families for purposes. The purpose was his covenant. Now we haven't time to look at all that, but it's interesting, isn't it, that when we come to the New Testament, that the blessing of Abraham that came to him via the covenant through God's choosing was, of course, the blessing of faith, through which Abraham got a grip of what it was to be free from the curse of guilt and the curse of the law, Paul says in Galatians 3:8. And we all flow on from that. So we come to that part in the notes there under D, that God has a national elective history. In other words, he's not just coming through Seth and these early people and the patriarchs, but it comes to fruition in the nation of Israel. And that the nation of Israel is corporately elect with a view, those notes there, to a holy relationship with a holy ministry, as we've seen in Exodus 19:5 and 6. And so that relationship is described by the writers in the Old Testament as coming from God, and God is described as the rock, not kind of hard and something you bounce off of, but strong and purposeful. Their God is their rock, their God is their potter. In other words, everything that happens within their nation bears the mark of the hands that have made it. You know, those of us that do pottery end up with great, or begin out with great visions. You know, you have a great lump of clay, and you see that beautiful bread crock, and it ends up an ashtray. You know, because keep chopping bits off the top goes wobbly, and all the potters will know what I'm talking about. But God's not like that, is he? He doesn't end up with an ashtray having started out with a bread crock in mind. So the fact that he was their potter was absolutely fantastic, and when they got together and believed that and lived in the good of it, it was great. He's seen as their caretaker in Isaiah 5 and 4. You know, as I said earlier in the week, not somebody who comes in after dark and does the sweeping, but kind of like the shepherd. He's their father, of course, that great revelation that Isaiah had, Father Redeemer. And so subjectively we can say Israel looked at all of that and saw that she was special property, not exclusive property. She went that way, of course, and eventually felt that, but special property. She saw that it was a serving relationship to a loving master. She had the relationship that Hosea calls as a wife, as a vineyard, tended, pruned, kept, weeded, all of that, and of the flock. Then we come, of course, that God's elective history never was intended to terminate with Israel, and kind of because Israel blew it, God had to have a second elective purpose. But in fact, all that Israel wasn't, because of her weakness and her rebellion, because God called her out of Egypt to be his son, all that she wasn't actually came to fruition in the Son. And so God's elective history comes to its pitch in the Son, in Christ. And so if we come to the New Testament, we see that the Apostle Paul and Peter and so on, they relate everything to being in that chosen one. In other words, in relationship with him. Now you'll have to work through those passages there. We haven't time, just a couple of minutes to go. But all those who are of faith are talked about as being in him, chosen in him before the foundation of the world, and so on. And so his holy love becomes effectual to us. And this is worked out in a corporate way. Just turn to that Ephesians 3 passage, because that's really powerful, isn't it, in terms of understanding our identity in all of this. Ephesians 3:14, that prayer of Paul's. This reason I bow my knee before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name, that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power through the Spirit in the inner man, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you be rooted and grounded in love, and comprehend with all the saints, not apart from them, but with them, what is the breadth and length, and so on, and know the love of Christ. That's the goal, if you like. That's the outworking, effectual outworking of God's electing us in him, that together we explore that. Now when we come on to that last point, and we just have to note it and stop, that God's elect history doesn't finish with the Son. It goes on to all the nations through the apostles and through the revelation that God gave them.